So I'm going to start with this question. So can introducing an identity label be beneficial? And I'll be thinking through the answer to that question. And we might think, well, if the effects of the label are negative, so if all the effects of label are negative, then it seems like clearly no. But I'll answer affirmatively by considering introducing labels for unlabeled but existent identities. So I'll argue that we have good metaphysical reason to think there can be identities that exist but are not yet labeled, and then think through the sort of dynamics that will come with introducing labels for those identities, and argue that that shows that identity labels can indeed be beneficial. So here's sort of a bit more meat on the bones of this sort of argument. So I'm going to consider the dynamics of label introduction by first doing two things. So drawing out potential harms from using labels and harms from not using labels. And then I'll be thinking about the interplay between the interests of more powerful and marginalized groups and their epistemic access to the lack of a label for their own identity group or for another identity group. And then I'll also be thinking about the role of in-group and out-group labeling. And I'm going to argue that the sort of way that these dynamics sort of interplay give us good reason to think that introducing labels for powerful or marginalized identity groups can bring important benefits that can't be brought in other ways. Right, so I sort of just said this. So right, so I'm going to argue that the introduction of labels for identity groups that are either dominant or marginalized can bring benefits, and that strategies can be taken to mitigate undesired effects. So I certainly accept that there can be harms, that there are harms from the use of identity labels, but I don't think those are strong enough to outweigh the benefits that couldn't be brought in other ways, and that there are sort of strategies one might take to avoid some of those. So the general claim that labeling does more bad than good, or that appeals, in general, appeals to identities are destructive, are too strong. I think identity labels can do important and good work. All right. So, okay, so here's the plan for the talk. So I'm going to start by saying a bit more about unlabeled identities. So I'm going to try to motivate the idea that there can be unlabeled identities, since that's the sort of starting point. That's the sort of case study I'm going to be looking at. And then I'm going to turn to effects, and in particular, mostly harms of failures to label identities. Then I'll turn to effects, and again, mostly harms of labeling identities. I'll then work through these sort of dynamics and consider introducing labels for unlabeled groups. And finally, offer some concluding remarks. Okay, so unlabeled identities. So we have labels for lots of identities. So the sorts of things I'm thinking of are things like Black, woman, queer, maybe American, Republican. So sort of what exactly one considers an identity, I think, is a question I sort of want to leave open. But certainly things like race, gender, and sexuality seem to be sort of paradigmatic identities, and we have labels for lots of those. There are also identities that were only very recently labeled. So expressions like cis, gender fluid, or non-binary are pretty recent additions to English as terms for identities. So it seems like, right, so those give some examples of identities that are now labeled, but that were not labeled, again, at least in English quite recently. Could there be genuinely unlabeled in a language L identities? So some think that there can't be. Appia has arguments that rely on the view that, to have an identity is to sort of function by adopting a label that shapes the way you engage with the world and the way you think of yourself. And so that view requires that there is a linguistic or conceptual sort of bit of resource that you have that you have in order to have the identity. But other social entities and kinds can exist without labels. So we might think, at least sort of initially, that there's some evidence to think that identities are like some of these other entities and could exist without sort of linguistic or conceptual resources. So several philosophers have argued that things like recessions or racism could exist without a label for, the label recession, or a label in any language, recession, or a conceptual representation that allows us to think about recessions. Nevertheless, we could, an economy could go into one of these sort of states, maybe this is happening now, and even if no one sort of recognized it or was able to pick it out with a concept or a term, nevertheless it could still exist. So Thomas and Khalidi have both thought about examples like that. Right, so that gives us some evidence that at least some social entities or kinds can exist without labels. But sort of to go back to Appiah's side, we might think, well, identities are really closely tied to our minds and experiences, maybe in ways that recessions aren't. Recessions and racism, if you're thinking of racism as the sort of structural phenomena that many do, are sort of less closely tied to minds. So you might think, well, even if some social entities or some social kinds can exist without labels or conceptualization, that doesn't yet show us that identities are like that. We might think identities are the sorts of things that do require us to represent them in some way. So to motivate the argument that there can be unlabeled identities, I'm going to think through this view of identities as understood in a sort of map-like fashion that's been argued for in sociology by William Cross, and in philosophy in particular by Sally Haslinger and Katherine Jenkins. So to start with a quote from Cross, he says, "One's identity is a maze or map that functions in a multitude of ways to guide and direct exchanges with one's social and material realities." So if we think of of identities, or you sort of think of your identity or one of your identities, if we think of identities as being these sort of multifaceted things, they, on this sort of picture, include things like the ways in which norms are, the ways in which you feel norms to apply to you. So you sort of feel normative constraints about how you ought to behave in the world, how you ought to interact, with, other in-group or in-identity members, and out-group, or, other identity, individuals with other identities. They can sort of shape how you move through social spaces. And again, that can be more sort of physical, like how much space are you taking up? Are you crossing your legs? Are you sitting with your legs further apart? But it can also be in terms of how much sort of testimonial space you take up, how talkative you are, who you engage with. They can involve ways you conceptualize, or one conceptualizes their body and their actions. Are you thinking of are you thinking of your body in a more or less sexualized way? Are you thinking of your body in a more or less athletic way, in a more or less nurturing way? So those are some of the ways that this sort of picture might apply. And Haslinger and Jenkins have argued that these are good ways to think of racial, and this sort of map-like picture is a useful framework to conceptualize racial and gender identity. So their views, so Jenkins is building off Haslinger, so I'm just going to read Haslinger's, where she's thinking about racial identity. So she says, one has an X racial identity, where X could be Black or white or some other racial identity, just in case their map is formed to guide someone marked as X through the social and material realities that are, in that context, characteristic of X's as a group. So again, this is going to be in terms of norms, in terms of conceptualization of the person's self-conceptualization of their body, of their actions, in terms of the ways in which they move through social space. And I've underlined the last expression in both of these quotes, so group or class. So both Haslinger and Jenkins are taking these identities to be things that could be shareable, right? So it's not just sort of that I have some private identity that's just mine, but these are norms and ways of conceptualizing one's body and ways of moving through social space that are sort of at the group level, or they, they could be had by many in a group or class. So if we have this kind of picture, both that identities are these sort of map-like things and that they are going to be guiding, many people potentially in a group or class, we can ask both, on this picture, could there be unlabeled identities and could there be unlabeled groups? So to begin to motivate the idea that there could be, we can sort of think back to this sort of map metaphor and recognize that maps can represent without labels. So if you think about the ways, so it's not the case that maps can represent something without any sort of representational device whatsoever, or at least I don't, that seems much more contentious, but certainly one can represent on a map that there's a river in a particular place. And it's not done necessarily by sort of pointing to the maybe blue line. And sorry, I also have a baby sort of squawking in the background if you hear that. So there might be a blue line. It could be marked that this is the Rhine or the Mississippi, but it could also be that there's a blue line here. And then in some sort of key, it says, things that are blue are water, and you recognize that it's a river in that sort of way. Or we can think about elevation being shown via those sort of elevation rings. So you can see that a part of a mountain is steeper, and that can be represented without it sort of saying this is the steepest point or this is the highest peak in this range of mountains. Hasslinger and Jenkins are also both interested in the idea of sort of aggregate or fragmented or fluid maps and the ways these can allow us to better model, at least on this sort of map-like picture, non-binary identities or multiracial identities or complex identities. So even if we don't have a term for a certain non-binary identity or a term for someone who's multiracial in particular ways, they're a sort of map-like representation of identity could involve different sorts of fragments of maps applying, or their map being fluid. So at one moment, at one time, a certain map is that which is guiding them, that they're sort of adopting and feeling, the norms apply to them, and that's sort of shaping how they're engaging in social space. And then at another time, a different map is. So their sort of gender identity, maybe if we're thinking of a gender fluid identity, could be composed of these sort of different maps at different times. So I think that this gives us some reason to think that there could be unlabeled identities. And I think we have reason to think that there could be unlabeled groups if we think of groups as being, sort of involving different sorts of external features or social structures that might position individuals. So these could exist without labels. So I think there's reason to think that there could be identities that are unlabeled in some language L. So there's obviously lots more that could be said about this. My aim here is just to do a bit to motivate this idea and then sort of work with it. So you can think of the whole talk as sort of conditional on this if you're not convinced. But I do want to note a couple of things I'm not taking this to require, and this doesn't require. So first, this doesn't require anything like inherently private identities. Rather, it involves things like combinations of norms applying or a lack of norms applying in terms of how one conceptualizes one's body or moves through social space and so on. So these are things that can be shared. They can be at the group or class level. I'm also not meaning to imply in any way that labels have no effects on identities. I think that is false. Labels can strengthen identities. I think labels can change identities. So I agree with Hacking that these things are possible. So just because an identity could exist unlabeled doesn't mean there's no sort of interesting dynamics between the sort of metaphysics of identities and the role of labels. But the thought would be that introducing a label could work to change an identity, but there was an identity, or at least there's possibly an identity there to begin with. Okay, so next I want to talk about some harms of and effects of failures to label identities. So starting first at the sort of most general level, or a more general sort of level. So many identities are picked out with nouns. They can be picked out with adjectives too, and some terms can be used in English again but many other languages I think as well, as both nouns and adjectives. And nouns have been argued in psychology in particular to promote a sort of kind-based reasoning and explanation. So if you're thinking about a term like sleepy versus a term like duck, the animal, those can elicit sort of different sorts of sort of standard reasoning patterns. So things that are sleepy can be sleepy for a moment and not sleepy the moment after. They drink a bit of coffee, maybe not the duck, but a person drinks a little coffee, they're not sleepy anymore. But things that are ducks are usually, ducks all the way through. They're ducks in different environments. They're ducks if they were raised by in different environments or by different parents. So this sort of kind-based reasoning is at least promoted by nouns. So having a lack of label, I think probably in the nominal or adjectival form, but certainly in the nominal form, can impede our ability to offer digestible explanations. So that would be one sort of potential effect of not having a label. To sort of draw this out, let's think about a little dialogue in between two people, so A and B. So A asks, why did Bradford do that? And B answers, and there's different sorts of answers B might give, because he's trans, because he's Black, because he's white, because he's a tall, funny linguist, because he's a man. So some of these might seem more suitable than others, where I'm taking suitability here to be, some of these might seem to answer the question in better ways than others and in more context than others. So I think there are contexts in which, there are probably contexts in which all of these work. I think the last one is the hardest to sort of envisage a context in which it might be a very good explanation. But we can sort of think through the sort of conversations where A is going to accept B's answer as being explanatory, as being a good answer, and sort of imagine contexts in which A is not going to accept it for various sorts of reasons. So we might think in some contexts, being Black might seem explanatory, but being white might not seem explanatory, because of the sorts of defaults that sometimes come with sort of dominant hegemonic identities. In some contexts, being Black might be an explanation because the person has particular stereotypes or thinks that there is sort of an underlying racial essence, but there are also contexts in which certain structural features could make it so that is a good explanation without sort of positing something sort of stereotypical or essentialist. So if if Bradford got pulled over by a police officer and he puts his hands on the steering wheel and talks very calmly and leaves his hands here and asks questions and doesn't make any sudden movements, and A is asking, well, why did Bradford do that? B might say, because he's Black. And this isn't because there's some sort of underlying essence that's sort of guiding him to act in a particular way, but obviously because of structural features related to police brutality that target people racialized as Black, so that this was going to be the sort of safest move for him to make. And then if we look now at this idea of, or at the expression of a tall, funny linguist, so why did Bradford do that? Because he's a tall, funny linguist. That seems quite hard to imagine a sort of context where A is going to be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Like that's going to explain a particular behavioral pattern. So it seems that, having a short expression, having a lexicalized noun for something, maybe an adjective too, but having something lexicalized can do some work in making something seem more explanatory to us. Okay, so other sorts of general effects of labeling identities. So successfully categorizing is correlated with lower linguistic complexity. So that's sort of just compactness of a label, having a short label. So if it's easier to name something, that has been shown to elicit more successful categorization. So the image here on the slide is a Bongard problem. So Bongard came up with these problems that they always have 6 images and 6 images. And what you're meant to do to solve the Bongard problem is to determine what would make something a member of one side and what would make something, what do these things have in common? What do these things have in common? And, if you were given another card, which would it go on the left side or would it go on the right side? So if you look at this example, maybe you're noticing like there's like different textures in the lines. Some are more some are more angular, some are more wiggly, but the lines either go clockwise or counterclockwise. So you could probably solve this problem quite quickly. And what Lupien and Zetterson found in a recent paper is that there are strong correlations between nameability, so if we have an expression for it, and how easily people could solve the problem. And they did this with color terms and colors on the sides, as well as things like going clockwise or counterclockwise, or triangles or squares, or things that are harder to describe because we don't have nice compact labels for them. So it seems again like we have some connection between language and successful categorization. So now moving less generally and rather thinking about the effects of failing to label dominant identities. A lack of a label for a dominant identity. So if we want to think about recently introduced terms, so think about the example of cis. So a lack of a label can lead to an identity being unmarked or seen as normal, just as the norm. To think back to that explanation example with Bradford, if whiteness is seen as just the norm or as unmarked, or if being cis is seen as normal or unmarked, it might not seem potentially explanatory because it's just not something to signal out as something that could explain. It's just sort of a background condition. I'm not saying this is true, but that's an example of how this might sort of work psychologically. It can make those with non-dominant identities appear deviant, not just deviant in sort of not meeting this sort of norm or unmarked status, but also deviant in the morally laden or normatively laden sense. It can also mask or obscure the way that an identity explains and how people with that identity have shared interests. So Mills brings this out really nicely in his discussions of white ignorance and thinking about how whiteness leads those to have a sort of shared ignorance in how the world works and how their identity is shaping their interests and shaping the world. What about failures to label marginalized identities now on the sort of other side? So I take it that failures to label marginalized identities constitute a form of hermeneutical injustice, a notion Miranda Fricker spells out as the injustice of having some significant area of one's social experience obscured from collective understanding, owing to a structural prejudice in the collective hermeneutical resources. So one lacks a label or a concept for their identity, and there's an injustice in that one sort of social experience is being obscured from the sort of larger community's understanding, and maybe from one's own understanding as well. And she takes it that it needs to be particularly in the person's interest to render this intelligible. So if it's not in someone's interest to render it intelligible, then this wouldn't be a form of hermeneutical injustice. It would be, another sort of lacuna in one's conceptual linguistic resources, but not a form of hermeneutical injustice. And it's also been argued that one can think about this both in terms of dominant or alternative resources. So Mason and Dotson have both made this argument where we're thinking about sort of broader community as the dominant community or more alternative resources. There are other effects as well of failing to label marginalized identities. So a lack of labels or concepts could impede organizing and fostering solidarity. So thinking about, the various sorts of tools one might use to organize with others to foster solidarity. So having these shared terms can do some real work. Iris Marion Young has this nice line where she says something like, in thinking about class struggle, and she says something like, someone can come to see like, I am a worker, and like, we are workers. So this idea of worker being a sort of linguistic tool that might promote solidarity and organizing, as it sort of allows one to see these sort of commonalities. Linguistic resources are also clearly needed to write laws and policy. We write things in language. So if one wants to, say, argue for reparations for a particular group, there needs to be ways to pick out that group in order to write a law to argue for their reparations for them. They can also, a lack of labels can also elicit false or unjust perceptions of who a person is, or maybe of what the person is, and could even shape people in ways that are inauthentic or give rise to dysphoria. So these, again, seem to be some of the things that are reported by those who don't fall into some of the sort of some of the identity categories that are seen as standard. Thinking particularly about things like gender, I think, is a good example there. Okay, so I just went through some effects of failing to label. I now want to go through some effects of labeling identities. So some of the effects of having labels for an identity are going to be clear from the discussion I just went through. So if lack of label can impede explanation, labels can facilitate explanation. If labels can mask that a category exists or is salient or isn't just the norm, having a label can unmask this, can make a category more salient. So in the case of the powerful, this can help reveal that the norm is really in the interest of the dominant group or a dominant group. In the case of marginalized, this can work to remedy hermeneutical injustice, to facilitate organizing, solidarity, and so on. But labels can certainly be harmful too. The sociolinguist Sally McConnell-Janae says, those who can resist being marked often do so. They decry labels as divisive and affirm people's individual distinctiveness. Treat us as individuals, they say, don't lump us all together, don't generalize. So she's clearly taking on a certain persona here and being, if you can't tell, like from the tone, she's being a little bit critical of this sort of argument. But I think she would agree, and I think all of us could agree in that there are certainly times where labels do lump people together and do sort of wash out differences, and that there is distinctiveness amongst people, and that can be important to highlight too. And labels can lump people together. So that's one sort of consideration. In-group and out-group effects are also facilitated by labels and generics. So in work going back all the way to the 70s, Tajfel et al. Have found that there's preference for in-group members rather than out-group members, and this can be facilitated by labels. There's just tons and tons of effects, so I'm just going to go through a couple. Positive information is also generalized more to in-group members, and negative information is generalized more to out-group members. This has been found by several, probably many psychologists, but at least in several studies. There's issues with, there's findings having to do with memory and empathy, again, where you're remembering more, differences amongst in-group members than out-group members. You're empathizing more with in-group members than out-group members. So, and in these cases, sometimes labels are used. There's mixed evidence as to whether labels are required for these effects or whether these are, more whether these are effects that labels can just facilitate, but there is at least some evidence that, or there's quite a bit of evidence that labels can facilitate this. Whether they're required or not is an open question. Labels and generics, so generics like ducks lay eggs, or social generics like women are nurturing or women love children, have also been argued to promote psychological essentialism, which is the view that a category is inductively rich. So there's a lot of sort of inferential potential. It's stable. So when you're in the category, you're going to be in it like straight on through. And it's explanatory. And moreover, that it has an underlying unobservable essence that determines category membership. So there again is a bunch of psychological research arguing that generics promote psychological essentialism. And maybe moreover that labels promote psychological essentialism. But there's also some reason to think, and that has led some to think that generics and labels ought to be avoided. So we shouldn't be using social generics at all. Maybe we shouldn't be using social labels at all. That's something that Leslie sort of alludes to or makes a brief comment about, but most of the arguments have been at least that we ought to be avoiding generics. Although there's also been some dispute about this. Jenny Saul and I have also argued against that sort of more broad view. And in part, the evidence is sort of, there's a lot of evidence going in different directions. And I think while there is evidence that generics and labels can essentialize, there's also other evidence that suggests that labels for social identities do not always essentialize. So there's some interesting work on different sorts of structural categories. So sort of setting up experiments where children or adults take it that a category is based on sort of social structural conditions, and it doesn't look like they essentialize. I was part of a study with Noyes and others looking at occupational categories, so sort of clearly social categories, we think, and we weren't finding essentialism, but we were finding really strong inductive potential. So yeah, so things are complicated. Further, while essentialism can have negative effects, it's also not always correlated with increased prejudice. In some cases, an increase in essentialism can actually lead to a reduction in prejudicial attitudes. So Nick Haslam and others have found this with categories like being gay. So if one takes there to be an essence, say a biological essence or a genetic marker, one believes that actually leads to a reduction of prejudicial attitudes. So again, things are more complicated than just labels essentialize. Essentialism is always bad. We should never use labels. Okay, so now I want to think through the last main part of the talk, and think about introducing labels for the unlabeled. So I'm going to argue that introducing a label for an unlabeled dominant or marginalized identity brings benefits not gotten in other ways and not necessarily outweighed by harms. So I'm going to do this by considering the positive and negative effects of in and out group usage of new labels, sort of building off what I just went through, and then argue that what I'm going to call priority thesis holds. So given the interplay, and the priority thesis says the following: given the interplay of epistemic access plus interests, uses of new labels will have positive effects before potentially having negative effects. Those negative effects might not manifest at all, and work can be done to mitigate them. So I'll go through that by thinking through these two cases. So again, to first do sort of some general, a little general argumentation, and then to go through both dominant and marginalized as our two cases. So in general, the introduction of labels for marginalized and dominant identities has positive epistemic effects. So effects like augmenting It's going to have effects like augmenting our linguistic or conceptual resources in other domains, right? Like when you first started doing philosophy, you probably didn't know a lot of expressions you now use in philosophy papers or in teaching or in, thinking about philosophy. And those concepts or that language can be helpful in sort of allowing us to clarify our thoughts and to think through different puzzles and problems. So there can be positive epistemic effects there. It can also, as I sort of said, unmask and allow for explanations that can reveal power differences. It can reveal hegemony and particularity of interests. It can alleviate hermeneutical injustice. We've had these positive epistemic effects that are coming quite generally. Now let's think about introducing labels for a dominant unlabeled identity group. And again, so I'm doing this in terms of like D sort of rather than a particular identity, because I'm wanting to be thinking through cases where we don't have a label for the identity. But if it's helpful, think about cis. So sort of think back not too long ago when the word cis wasn't in English as a label for an identity, and sort of you can think through how this might go. So consider the introduction of a label D for a previously unlabeled dominant identity. So we can now think about other or outgroup uses of D and also self or in-group uses of D. So others, outgroup members using D can use it to better describe and explain. This might help in consciousness raising, sort of in recognizing that Ds have a lot of power in working to remedy epistemic occlusion. Self or in-group uses of D can also involve, recognizing that that this sort of norm or default is not actually, is actually a particular, involves a particular set of interests. So it can involve that sort of recognition. It could also involve, being now able to explain and to work to change hierarchy. But some self or in-group labeling is also going to be far less positive, I think. So some self or in-group labeling can involve focusing on privilege or being apologetic or sort of centering the dominant group still. So I think, those cases are those aren't the sort of the worst possible effects, but they're certainly not going to be the most helpful either. Worse, they can also involve, in-group uses can also involve strengthening in-group preferences or solidarity, sort of thinking about some of those in-group effects, in-group out-group effects, strengthening solidarity amongst dominant in-group members, potentially leading to more prejudice or violence. And those seem to be, the extremely harmful potential effects of having this new linguistic resource, D. And I think we kind of, the following sort of pattern comes out, that stronger self-identification with the label, with the concept, with the identity can lead to more negative effects. So that those who, recognize that they're, in-group members, recognize that they are members of the group, and are then using that to try to explain and understand, that's sort of not much self-identification. Towards the sort of, middle line where one's sort of recognizing one's privilege and really wanting to focus on it a lot. That's sort of a little bit more self-identification, and then ultimately to the, those who are really strongly thinking like, this is who I am, this is what I am, like we are this really important group. That's the sort of strongest self-identification, and I think we see the most negative effects there. So it's, in many cases, I take it, it's to the advantage of the dominant group not to be labeled. So taking one's identity to sort of just be the norm or a background condition or something that is just, everyone else is deviant and this is just like how a person is, that, not labeling can help to make that seem like that's the way the world is. And there's some interesting sociolinguistic work showing that dominant groups often don't self-label. So Eckert and McConnell-Janae have looked at high school groups and sort of, the most popular kids often don't have other people might have a label for them, but they don't. They're like, no, we're just students, or we're just whatever. They probably wouldn't say students. Whatever, they don't label themselves as like the popular kids or something, but they have labels that they use for other groups. So it seems like this, and I think with cis or with white, I think we see a lot of the same pattern. So because of this sort of, because it can be advantageous for dominant groups not to self-label, I take it it's likely that D will be introduced and used by others first, used by outgroup members first. And we saw that outgroup member uses tend to be positive. It allows for more explanation, recognition of the different sort of power dynamics, the ability to consciousness raise, and so on. So this means that the priority thesis is met. So given this interplay of epistemic access, who has access to the existence of the identity, plus interest, so the dominant group having an interest not to self-label, uses of the new label will have positive effects before having negative effects, and those negative effects might not come about, they could be mitigated. Right, so once those, right, so if the label is adopted for in-group use, some of those are also positive in terms of explanation, in terms of trying to remedy hierarchy, say. So again, yeah, negatives might not occur. And in those cases where there are sort of strong negatives, like, right, so something like a white power movement coming about, it seems like those harmful uses are, are not just, like, I think they're related to the label. I think like having the label there is a tool that can be used. But I take it that those often, those sorts of movements or those sorts of beliefs and actions often come to be with a feeling of a loss of power. So the label's doing some work, but it's not sort of like you get the label and this falls out, or this is like the consequence of having that label, but that there are very complicated different sorts of power imbalances that can start to play out, and that language is just one piece in this complicated picture. Okay, so what about introducing labels for marginalized groups? So let's now consider an introduction of a label M for a previously unlabeled marginalized identity. So if you want to sub in something for M to make this more concrete, maybe think about the recent introduction of gender fluid or non-binary. So self or in-group uses of M are going to lead to things, are going to allow for greater self-understanding. They might diminish dysphoria, they could promote organizing and solidarity, and so on. Other outgroup uses of M could also be positive, right? So they could involve recognition, they could involve, better understanding and explanation, but they can also involve more negative things like an increase in stereotyping or outgroup bias, maybe an increase in essentialism. And I think we can see another sort of pattern coming to be. So stronger sort of otherizing or representing an outgroup member or an outgroup as really distinct and other, as maybe a different kind of person, or maybe a different kind period, not really thinking of them as people at all, leads to or makes probable more negative effects. So if you're sort of thinking, oh, now I'm recognizing that there is another group and that these individuals have different experiences than I do, that's sort of much less otherizing, the sort of way I'm trying to use the term, than say thinking like these people or those M's are are just a completely different kind, like we ought not to have them in our society. That's clearly going to be stronger otherizing and more negative effects. So who's going to have epistemic access to the lack of a label for the identity? So I take it that it's people with the identity that are going to be those that recognize that there is, in Polhouse's terminology, or as Polhouse says, a tension between our resources and the world. So who recognizes that there is this sort of lacuna? I take it it's those who, aren't fitting into the different sort of categories or under the labels that we are already using. So those with the identity have have specific access to it, and also have the strongest interest to better conceptualize and share, at least with other in-group members, that they do share this identity. And I've argued that in-group or self-labeling will generally have positive effects, and those effects are going to come first because of the sort of epistemic access and the stronger interests in conceptualization, say. So that means the priority thesis is met. So again, given the interplay of epistemic access and interest, uses of the new labels will have positive effects before potentially having negative effects. But what about those potential harms? It does seem like, clearly there can be harms that come with the use of label, especially labels for marginalized identity members or marginalized group members. So to give a particularly sort of graphic example, so suppose here's what happens. So M is introduced. First, it brings some benefits, as I've argued. M's are able to recognize and feel less, recognize that that there is an identity that's shared amongst other individuals, and they're able to organize a little bit and feel less dysphoria. Okay, that's all good. But later, this leads to increased stereotyping, which leads to dehumanization, more dehumanization, and then ultimately it leads to the murder of many people who are M. So clearly this is a heinous situation, a heinous scenario. So what is the role of language in this scenario? So I think, I sort of alluded to this on a few slides ago, I think this is really complicated, and I don't have, I definitely haven't figured out the right way to sort of think through all of this. I think, language is one component in understanding socio-political dynamics. So I think language is part of the story here. So if the label can make certain things easier, it can facilitate explanation, it can make it easier for people to target a group, say. So that's certainly something harmful that maybe wouldn't have happened without the label. But I think labels are also just part of the story, and that there's various different factors. One way to sort of draw this out is we can also imagine an alternative way the introduction of M could have run. So M is introduced, and we can imagine that not leading to atrocities. So it seems that the connection between an introduction of M and genocide, say, while there might be a connection in this sort of case, it seems very, to use this terminology from the causation literature, it seems very sensitive or unstable. So small changes in the background circumstances could make it so that doesn't happen. Sort of like, the Big Bang led me to give this talk today. It's like, sure, I guess if the Big Bang hadn't occurred, I wouldn't be giving this talk today. But the sort of causal connection is super sensitive. All sorts of different things matter in that sort of interim. And I think with language, there might be a similar sort of idea to push. So it's not the case that the label has, isn't part of the story as to how these extremely negative things can happen. But I don't think it's sort of the super kind of close connection where it's like, well, we definitely shouldn't have had the label because then this wouldn't have happened. I think there's lots of other intervening things that could also have been shifted, and we could still have had the benefits from the introduction of the label without having these extreme negatives. I think there are also strategies that can be taken to reduce the possibility of some of these harms. So to think back to this idea of alternative resources versus dominant resources. So a label could be introduced as part of alternative resources and not used by dominant groups. One could also work to develop strategies to avoid epistemic appropriation or elite capture. Okay, so I'm a little over time anyway, so let me just wrap up real quick. So my aim today was to consider the dynamics of what labels can do for good and for ill by thinking about introducing labels for identities that are that were not previously labeled. So I've argued that there are benefits that can come from introducing a label or concept for an unlabeled identity, and that harms might not obtain, and moreover, strategies can be taken to work to mitigate those harms. And I want to just note that I focused on labeling unlabeled identities, not introducing new labels for already labeled identities. So I think the dynamics are different in this sort of case. So who has epistemic access to the existence of a previously labeled identity group? Like everybody, right? There's not this sort of difference in epistemic access there. And who has interest maybe in further stigmatizing that group? Not in-group members, plausibly out-group members. So if we're thinking about introducing a new term for an identity that's already labeled, this is, I think, just a very different sort of case. So thinking about, say, Lynn Terrell's work on genocidal language, so dominant group members can introduce terms for outgroup minorities or marginalized identity groups that disenfranchise and dehumanize and further derogate. But that's a different kind of case than what I've been thinking about. Yeah, because of these differences in epistemic access and interests of different groups. I also want to note that, of course, there are cases in which identities are appealed to in harmful ways. I think everybody accepts this. So I don't mean to be undermining that idea. But I take it that that it's useful to have a greater, it's useful to have a greater range of tools. Doesn't show that any one tool is the best for all purposes or in every context. Identity labels, like other tools, like hammers, can be useful for some purposes and harmful in others. So, right, to conclude, I've argued that a blanket claim against identity terms goes too far. Introducing labels can bring important benefits that are not outweighed or not necessarily outweighed by potential harms. Thanks.